Min Seok Kong didn't fear death. He feared the red ink on his desk. In his world, red ink meant a death sentence, but this wasn't a threat from a rival syndicate. It was a goodbye from the only woman he ever loved. 8 months ago, Zora Bennett marked his most dangerous secret with a warning, "Do not open," and vanished into thin air. Now, with his empire crumbling and his enemies at the door, Min Seok's fingers tremble over the seal. To open it is to save his life. To leave it closed is to keep his promise to a ghost. Min Seok Kong was a man of cold logic, the architect of a billion-dollar shadow empire where every move was calculated. He thought he was untouchable until a rain-slicked night in a Brooklyn alley left him bleeding out. He expected a hitman. Instead, he got Zora. Zora Bennett was a trauma nurse who lived her life in the bright, sterile halls of the ER, far from the darkness Min Seok called home. She saved his life that night not because she knew who he was, but because her heart wouldn't let her do anything else. For 2 years, they lived in a fragile sanctuary, a black woman from the light and a Korean man from the shadows, building a love that defied every rule of the syndicate. But the shadows always catch up. When Zora accidentally intercepted a courier package meant for the chairman, she saw the blood on Min Seok's hands that no amount of medical scrubbing could wash away. She didn't scream and she didn't call the police. She simply picked up a red pen, marked the truth, "Do not open," and walked out of his life. Or so he thought, until a frantic call from his own hospital changed everything. Before we reveal the secret inside that envelope, hit that subscribe button, like in this video, and comment "Red" if you've ever been warned about someone you loved. The silence in the penthouse was thick, heavy with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the weight of things left unsaid. Min Seok sat behind his mahogany desk, the city lights of Seoul twinkling like cold diamonds through the floor-to-ceiling glass. But his world was narrowed down to a single point of focus, a weathered brown envelope resting in the center of his desk. Across the front, scrawled in a shade of red ink so deep it looked like dried blood, were 3 words that had paralyzed a man who didn't believe in fear: "Do not open." Zora had written those words 8 months ago, her hand steady even as her eyes overflowed with a grief he couldn't fix. In his culture, writing someone's name in red ink was a curse, a sign of death. Zora hadn't written his name, but she had marked the truth. She had found the ledger, the one document that proved Min Seok wasn't just a businessman with complicated interests, but the kingpin of a shadow empire that thrived on the very trauma she spent her days treating in the ER. He reached out, his thumb brushing the edge of the adhesive. For months, he had honored her warning, treating the envelope like a religious relic. But tonight, his empire was screaming. A rival faction had seized his northern ports, and the information inside that envelope, the names, the bank accounts, the leverage, was the only weapon left to stop a massacre. "Is this the price, Zora?" he whispered to the empty room. "To save my life, I have to become the man you hated?" Just as his fingernail caught the edge of the adhesive, the sharp, rhythmic trill of his private phone shattered the stillness. It wasn't the burner he used for the syndicate. It was the line registered to his legitimate holdings at Kang Memorial Hospital. He answered before the second ring. "Speak." "Mr. Kong," the voice on the other end was frantic, the professional veneer of the hospital director cracking. "We have a critical admission. A woman was brought in by ambulance. She's in a state of advanced distress, massive internal hemorrhaging." Min Seok's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white, his tattoos stretching over his tense muscles. "Why are you calling my private line for a standard trauma case?" "It's Zora Bennett, sir," the director breathed. "She was found collapsed in a park 3 blocks from the hospital. She's pregnant, Min Seok, and she's calling for you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The envelope slid from his hand, falling to the floor unnoticed. 8 months. He had spent 8 months hunting for her in every corner of the globe, never realizing she had stayed right under his nose, carrying a secret that made his empire look like a pile of dust. The red ink on the desk suddenly didn't look like a warning anymore. It looked like a trail of blood, leading him back to the only thing that mattered. He didn't grab his coat. He didn't call his security detail. He simply ran, leaving the "do not open" warning behind, finally understanding that some secrets are meant to be broken. 3 years ago, the rain in Brooklyn didn't fall. It was punished. Min Sok stumbled into the mouth of a narrow alleyway off Atlantic Avenue, his breath coming in jagged, wet rattles. One hand was clamped over his side, trying to hold in the life that was leaking through his fingers, while the other gripped a gutter pipe to keep from collapsing. The ambush had been clean, professional, and nearly fatal. As his vision began to fray at the edges, he saw a shadow moving toward him, not the sharp, predatory silhouette of a hitman, but something softer, draped in a rain-soaked hoodie. Zora had been taking the long way home after a grueling double shift at the hospital, her mind occupied by patient charts and the persistent ache in her feet. When she saw the man slumped against the brickwork, her instincts didn't scream danger, they screamed trauma. She didn't see the expensive silk suit ruined by grime or the intricate dark ink of a dragon's tail curling up his neck. She saw a human being whose clock was ticking down. "Don't call the police," Min Sok rasped, the words thick with the taste of copper. He looked up, expecting her to flee. Instead, she dropped her bag and knelt in the oily puddle beside him. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the storm of his panic. "And right now, you're not a criminal or a saint. You're just a bleeder. Hold this." She pressed his own hand harder against the wound and reached into her bag, pulling out a makeshift kit she always carried. Under the flicker of a dying street lamp, she worked with a clinical, rhythmic grace. Min Sok watched her through a haze of pain. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, loyalty, money, or his life. But this woman, with her steady hands and eyes that held a strange, fierce kindness, wanted nothing but to keep his heart beating. As she threaded a needle, the silver glinting against her dark skin, he felt a sensation more terrifying than the stabbing: peace. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, looking him in the eye for the first time. At that moment, the black ice of the Kang Syndicate melted. He saw the woman who would become his sanctuary, and she saw the man hidden beneath the armor of his tattoos. "Why?" he managed to ask as the needle pierced his skin. "Because life is heavy enough," Zora replied, her focus never wavering as she stitched the jagged tear in his side. By the time she finished, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. She helped him lean back against the wall, her thumb lingering for a fraction of a second against the ink on his neck. She didn't ask his name, and he didn't offer it. He simply watched her disappear into the fog, a ghost in blue scrubs who had given him the one thing he couldn't buy: a second chance. He didn't know then that the wound she stitched would heal, but the mark she left on his soul would never fade. In the months that followed that rainy night, Zora's small apartment became the only place on Earth where Min Sok Kang was allowed to be human. It was a sanctuary of mismatched furniture, the scent of lavender detergent, and the soft hum of a nurse's life. When he stepped through her door, he shed the weight of the Kang Syndicate like a heavy, blood-stained coat. He would leave his bodyguards at the end of the block, trade his hand-tailored Italian blazers for the worn cotton hoodies she bought him, and sit at her cramped kitchen table while she recounted the small victories of her shift. For Min Sok, Zora was a revelation. She was the first person who didn't look at his tattoos and see a weapon. She looked at the scars he'd collected and saw a map of survival. Their romance bloomed in the quiet hours between her double shifts and his midnight meetings. He loved the way she took her coffee, black and piping hot, and the way she fell asleep mid-sentence when she was exhausted, her head resting on his shoulder. In those moments, the chairman didn't exist. There was only Min Sok Kang, a man who found himself buying groceries just to see her smile and learning the names of the neighbors so he could ensure their street remained the safest in the city. But Min Sok was a man built of shadows, and shadows have a way of streaching into even the brightest rooms. He tried desperately to keep his business outside her door, but the world he ruled was not one that respected boundaries. It started with the subtle things, the way he would instinctively position himself between Zora and the window, or the cold, predatory sharpness that entered his eyes whenever her phone rang an unknown number. He was a kingpin trying to play house, and the friction was starting to show. One evening, while Zora was in the kitchen humming a song her grandmother used to sing, Min Sok's private burner phone vibrated on the coffee table. The screen displayed a single encrypted string of text. The shipment was seized. We need a signature for the redirect. He glanced at Zora, her silhouette framed by the warm light of the stove, the personification of everything pure he had left. He felt the familiar pull of the darkness, the cold requirement of his status. He deleted the message, his jaw tight, but the peace of the apartment suddenly felt fragile, like glass under a hammer. He realized then that he wasn't just hiding his world from Zora, he was hiding Zora from a world that would use her to destroy him. He reached for her hand as she sat down, his grip a little too tight, his heart heavy with the knowledge that a man cannot live in two worlds forever, without one of them eventually catching fire. The collision of his two lives happened on a Tuesday, a day that should have been defined by the mundane domesticity Min Sok had grown to crave. He was in the shower, the steam rising to meet the cold tile, while Zora hummed in the living room, organizing her nursing textbooks for her upcoming certification exam. The sound of the doorbell was sharp, an intrusion into their quiet morning that made Min Sok freeze under the spray of water. By the time he had thrown on a robe and stepped into the hallway, it was too late. A courier in a nondescript gray uniform was already heading back to the elevator, and Zora was standing by the door, holding a heavy manila envelope. "Min Sok, someone just dropped this off," she said, her voice light and unsuspecting. "It's marked urgent." He reached for it, his heart performing a slow, sickening roll in his chest. But the envelope was unsealed. As she handed it to him, the weight caused the contents to slide forward. A stack of high-gloss surveillance photographs spilled onto the floor, fanning out like a deck of cursed cards. Zora looked down, her breath hitched. The photos weren't of business meetings or real estate. They were images of a man, one of the hospital's regular charity donors, bound to a chair in a dark warehouse, his face a map of bruises that Min Sok recognized all too well as his own handiwork. Clipped to the back of the photos was a ledger, the columns filled with numbers that didn't represent profits, but the price of clearing the city's docks of human cargo. The room went cold. The scent of lavender from the laundry was suddenly drowned out by the metallic, imaginary smell of the blood in those pictures. Zora looked from the floor to Min Sok's face, her eyes searching for a lie, a denial, a reason to believe that the man she loved wasn't the architect of the misery in those photos. "Zora, let me explain," he started, his voice cracking. He reached out, his tattooed hand, the hand that had held her so gently just an hour before, now appearing monstrous in the morning light. She recoiled as if he had struck her. She didn't see the man who liked his coffee black anymore. She saw the red side of his business, the side that treated human lives like line items on a balance sheet. The silence that followed wasn't the peaceful quiet of their sanctuary. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a grave. She didn't scream. She didn't even cry. She simply knelt, gathered the photos with trembling fingers, and placed them back into the envelope. Her gaze was hollow, the light he had spent months basking in finally extinguished. She looked at him, really looked at him, and Min Sok realized with a gut-wrenching certainty that the shadow he had tried so hard to keep outside had finally walked through the door and claimed them both. The air in the apartment felt thin, as if the revelation had sucked the oxygen from the room. Min Sok stood paralyzed, watching the woman who had once been his peace transform into his judge. He waited for the explosion, the screaming, the accusations that he was a monster, words he had heard in his nightmares, but never from her lips. But Zora didn't scream. The silence she maintained was far more devastating. She moved with a slow, deliberate calmness that chilled him to the bone. walking over to the small desk in the corner where she kept her nursing journals. Her fingers, which had so often traced the tattoos on his skin with tenderness, now reached for a pen, a red felt-tip pen. She walked back to the coffee table where the manila envelope lay, the heavy, cursed evidence of his double life. With a steady hand, she scrawled 3 words across the center of the paper in thick, aggressive strokes. "Do not open." The red ink bled into the fibers of the envelope, looking like a fresh wound against the dull brown paper. She didn't look at the photos again. She looked only at him, her dark eyes reflecting a profound disappointment and a love that was fighting its final, losing battle. "You told me you were building something for us," she said, her voice a low, vibrating chord of heartbreak. "But you were building it on top of them, on top of the people I try to save every single day." "Zora, it's for protection," he began, the excuse tasting like ash in his mouth. "The world I live in, the world you choose," she corrected him. She pointed to the envelope. "That package contains the power you think you need to stay on top. It's your leverage, your empire, your soul." She stepped closer, and for a moment, the scent of her lavender soap mocked him. "I am giving you one choice, Min Seok. If you ever break that seal, if you ever look at those names or use that information to play God again, you lose me. Not just for a night, not just for a fight, forever." She didn't wait for him to agree. She didn't ask for a promise she knew his ambition might break. She simply laid the red pen down next to the marked package. The "do not open" warning wasn't just an instruction, it was a boundary line drawn in blood-colored ink. "I can't live in the dark, Min Seok," she whispered, her voice finally breaking, "and I won't let you drag me there." She turned away, leaving him standing in the middle of their sanctuary, staring at the red ink. At that moment, the chairman of the Kang Syndicate realized he was holding the keys to a kingdom, but the woman who made that kingdom worth ruling was already halfway out the door. The sun rose over the city with a cruel, indifferent brightness, spilling across the mahogany floors of the penthouse. Min Seok stirred, his hand instinctively reaching across the silk sheets for the warmth that usually met him there. His fingers found only cold, taut fabric. The silence in the room wasn't the peaceful hush of a sleeping home. It was the hollow, ringing quiet of a tomb. He sat up, his heart already beginning a slow, heavy thud against his ribs. "Zora?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and foreign in the vast space. There was no answer, no sound of the shower running, no clink of a coffee mug, no soft humming of a gospel tune. He moved through the apartment like a ghost, his panic rising with every empty room he discovered. In the bathroom, her toothbrush was gone. In the closet, the space where her colorful scrubs and floral dresses usually hung was a jagged, empty gap between his somber black suits. She hadn't just left, she had performed a surgical extraction of herself from his life. Min Seok returned to the living room, his legs feeling like lead. There, sitting in the center of the coffee table, was the manila envelope. The red ink of her warning, "Do not open," seemed to glow with a malevolent intensity in the morning light. Beside it lay her key to the penthouse and her grandmother's gold cross necklace, the one she never took off. It was her way of telling him that she hadn't just walked away from his world, she had left the version of herself that loved him behind. He grabbed his phone, dialing her number with trembling fingers. "The number you have reached is no longer in service." He tried her sister in Atlanta, her best friend from the nursing college, and even the head nurse at the clinic where she volunteered. Each call ended the same way, a wall of silence or a dial tone. Zora was a trauma nurse. She knew how to stop a bleed, and she had closed the wound of their relationship with terrifying efficiency. By noon, his head of security arrived with a grim expression. "Sir, we checked the transit hubs and her bank records. She pulled her savings in cash last afternoon. Her social media is deleted. Her lease was bought out by an anonymous third party 2 weeks ago." Min Seok sank into his chair, staring at the red ink on the envelope. He was the chairman of the King Syndicate, a man who could find anyone, anywhere. But Zora knew his reach better than anyone. She hadn't just hidden, she had erased her existence from his grid. He realized then that the do not open warning wasn't just about the package, it was the seal on a life that was now officially over. He had kept his empire, but as he looked around the sterile, golden cage of his penthouse, he had never felt more like a man with nothing. The pressure within the Kang Syndicate was no longer a slow simmer. It was a boiling cauldron of mutiny. Min Sok sat at the head of the long obsidian table in the boardroom, the air thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and the unspoken threat of violence. His three top captains, men who had bled for the Kang name, stood across from him, their faces masks of disciplined fury. The Park family has taken 3 of our distribution hubs in a single night, Chairman. Jin Ho, the eldest captain, growled, leaning heavily on the table. Our men are dying in the streets while you sit here staring at a ghost. We know what's in that envelope. We know it has the offshore accounts, the political leverage, and the names of the Park family's silent partners. Open it, and we end this war by sunrise. Min Sok didn't look up. His gaze was fixed on the manila envelope resting before him. The red ink of Zora's warning, "Do not open," had faded slightly over the months, but in his mind it was as vivid as a fresh arterial spray. It was the only piece of her he had left, a final boundary she had drawn to see if he was capable of change. The contents of this package are not for the Syndicate, Min Sok said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. With all due respect, sir, the Syndicate is currently burning, another captain countered, his hand straying toward the holster beneath his jacket. If you don't use that leverage, the Parks will be in this room by tomorrow night. Are you going to let us all die for a nurse's ultimatum? She's gone, Chairman. She isn't coming back to see you play the martyr. Min Sok finally looked up, and the sheer, glacial coldness in his eyes made the captain flinch. He thought of the rady alleyway, the smell of lavender, and the way Zora had looked at him before she vanished, as if she were mourning a man who was already dead. If he opened this seal, he would survive the night, but he would prove her right. He would be nothing more than the monster she feared, and any hope of a future with her would truly be incinerated. Then let it burn, Min Sok said, his voice devoid of hesitation. He slid the envelope into his inner breast pocket, right over his heart. I made a promise, not to the Syndicate and not to the Parks, to her. If you want to challenge my leadership because I value my word over your greed, do it now. But as long as I breathe, this seal remains unbroken. The captains exchanged looks of disbelief and budding betrayal. They saw a man who had lost his mind. Min Sok felt like a man who had finally found his soul. He walked out of the room, his back turned to their drawn weapons, knowing he had just traded his safety for a memory. He was a king without a kingdom, but for the first time in 8 months, he felt like a man Zora might actually recognize. The tires of the black sedan screamed against the pavement as Min Sok skidded into the emergency bay of Kang Memorial. He didn't wait for his driver to open the door. He was out and running before the engine had fully died. The sterile, bright lights of the hospital, once a source of pride for his legitimate portfolio, now felt like 1,000 needles pressing against his skin. He shoved through the double doors of the maternity wing, his heart a frantic, even rhythm that drowned out the quiet beeps of the monitors. He found her in room 412. The air inside was still, heavy with the scent of antiseptic and that faint, lingering note of lavender he had chased through his dreams for 8 months. Zora lay in the high-backed bed, her skin pale against the white sheets, her dark hair fanned out like a halo. She looked fragile, yet as he stepped closer, he saw the familiar set of her jaw, the quiet, unbreakable strength that had always made his criminal empire look like a house of cards. And then he saw it, the swell of her stomach beneath the thin hospital gown. Zora, he breathed, the word breaking in his throat.
He sank into the plastic chair beside her, his hand trembling as he reached toward her, then pulling back, fearing his touch was still too tainted for this room. Her eyes opened slowly. There was no shock in them, only a weary, profound clarity. "You didn't open it," she whispered. It wasn't a question.
Min-sok reached into his jacket and pulled out the manila envelope. The red ink was smudged from the sweat of his palms, but the seal was perfectly intact. "The syndicate is gone, Zora. The parks have the docks. My captains have walked away. I have nothing left but this promise." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, and she placed her hand over the "Do not open" scrawl. "I didn't leave because of the photos, Min-sok. I left because I needed to know what you loved more, the power those photos gave you, or the life we could have. That package wasn't just evidence, it was a mirror. I knew the moment you broke that seal, you would be choosing the throne over your own blood." She took his hand then, guiding his tattooed fingers to the crown of her stomach. Beneath his palm, he felt a sharp rhythmic kick, a life he hadn't known existed, a legacy that didn't require a ledger or a gun. "I've been here the whole time, Min-sok," she said softly, "working the night shifts, watching your cars drive past, waiting to see if the red ink would be enough to stop you. You were a king who had everything, Min-sok. I needed to see if you could be a father who had nothing." The monitors chirped a steady, peaceful cadence. Min-sok leaned his forehead against the railing of the bed, the tears finally coming. He had lost a kingdom, but as he felt the kick of his child against his hand, he realized he had never been more powerful. He looked at the envelope one last time and realized it didn't contain his secrets, it had contained his freedom. The smell of hospital floor wax was suddenly choked out by the heavy, metallic scent of ozone and gunpowder. Min-sok stood in the center of the private corridor, the heavy doors of the maternity ward locked behind him. At the other end of the hall, the shadows shifted. Jin-ho and the remaining captains emerged, their silhouettes sharp against the fluorescent lights, their faces twisted with a desperate, frantic hunger. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were men who had lost their safety net, and they had come to reclaim the only currency that mattered. "The parks are 2 blocks away, Min-sok," Jin-ho spat, his hand trembling as he leveled his weapon. "They've taken the penthouse. They've taken the docks. Give us the ledger. Give us the names. If we don't have that leverage to negotiate, we're all dead men walking." Min-sok didn't flinch. He reached into his breast pocket and slowly pulled out the manila envelope. The red ink was stark, a vivid reminder of the choice that had brought him to this moment. He could hear the faint rhythmic beeping of the monitors from Zora's room behind him, the heartbeat of a future he had only just begun to understand. "You think this paper is your salvation. You think having the power to destroy others is what keeps you alive. But all it does is make you a slave to the fear of losing it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver lighter, the flint sparking with a sharp mechanical click. A small, blue-orange flame danced in the sterile air. "Chairman, don't!" Jin-ho screamed, taking a step forward. Min-sok touched the flame to the corner of the envelope. The paper caught instantly, the fire hungrily devouring the red ink first. He held it up, the heat blistering his thumb, but he didn't let go. He watched as the names of politicians, the offshore account numbers, and the maps of his black market routes turned into blackened, curling flakes of ash. "There is no Kang Syndicate anymore," Min-sok declared, his eyes locked on his rivals as the fire reached his fingers. "The information you're willing to kill for is gone. I am no longer your chairman. I am just a man protecting his family." He dropped the charred remains onto the linoleum floor and ground them into dust with the heel of his boot. The captains stood frozen, their leverage incinerated, their faces pale with the realization that the man they feared had finally become someone they couldn't control. Without the package, they had no reason to stay and no power to fight. "Leave," Min-sok commanded, "before I remember how to be the man who wrote those papers." As the men retreated into the night, defeated by a choice they couldn't comprehend, Min-sok leaned against the wall and exhaled. He had nothing left. No title, no wealth, no army.
But as the door behind him cracked open and he heard the first thin cry of his newborn daughter, he knew he had finally won.
The golden morning light of the suburbs was a world away from the neon-soaked shadows of the syndicate. Min-sok sat on the porch of a modest brownstone, the weight of a sleeping infant pressed against his chest. He looked at his hands, the ink of the dragon still visible on his skin, but the calluses from triggers had been replaced by the steady strength of a man who now built things to last. Behind him, he could hear Zora in the kitchen, the familiar clink of a coffee mug, and the soft hum of a song that sounded like peace. This life was quiet, but it was the loudest victory he had ever won. The world would say he'd lost everything, his wealth, his influence, his terrifying name, but as he looked down at his daughter's face, he knew the truth. True power was never found in the ability to crush others. It was found in the ability to restrain oneself. It was the strength to look at a kingdom and say, "Not at this price." Min-sok's journey had taught him that the most dangerous form of blindness isn't the inability to see, but the refusal to look away from greed. By choosing to remain blind to the contents of that envelope, he had kept his vision of love clear. He had learned that a man's legacy isn't written in the secrets he keeps to protect his pride, but in the truths he is willing to sacrifice for his soul. He had traded a throne for a home, and in the silence of the morning, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking over his shoulder, he was looking forward to it. Zora stepped out onto the porch, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't need to ask if he regretted it. She saw the answer in the way he held their child, not as a possession, but as a promise. They were no longer the nurse and the boss, the light and the shadow. They were simply two people who had realized that life is not a ledger to be balanced, but a gift to be guarded. The red ink had faded from the paper, but the lesson it carved into his heart remained. The greatest secrets aren't the ones we hide, but the ones we are brave enough to burn. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing what not to look at. If you believe Zora was right to test him, share this story and comment "redeemed" below. Don't miss our next story of love in the shadows. Hit that subscribe button to stay in the light. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.